In the small and quiet town of Springfield, located in Vermont, life went on as usual. The town, with a population of just over 4,000 people, has always seemed like an ideal place for those who strive for peace and quiet. Streets with neatly trimmed lawns, friendly neighbors, and well-kept houses created a picture of a typical American countryside, where everyone knew everyone, and news traveled faster than the morning newspaper arrived. The Hatcher family has always been visible to local residents. Richard and Martha Hatcher moved to Springfield 20 years ago when their children, James and Elizabeth, were very young. Richard, a man about 52 years old, built his own construction business from scratch, which allowed him to provide his family with everything they needed. He was a man of strong principles and always believed in hard work and discipline. His stern but fair character earned him respect in the town, especially among those who worked on his construction sites. Martha, Richard's wife, worked as a teacher at a local school. She was a kind-hearted and sympathetic woman in her early 50s who retained her natural charm and tenderness, which made her a favorite among her students and colleagues. Despite her gentleness, Martha always tried to maintain strict moral principles in the family, although it seemed that she did not always understand or accept the choices of her children. James, the eldest son, was an intelligent and reserved young man. At 25 years old, he worked at the local library, where he got a job right after graduating from college. Since childhood, James was distinguished by a penchant for reflection and solitude, preferring to spend time reading books rather than in the company of peers. His calm disposition and deep immersion in the world of knowledge often caused bewilderment in his father, who believed that his son should be more active and active. However, James never felt the need to live up to his father's expectations, preferring to follow his own interests. Elizabeth, James's younger sister, was the complete opposite of her brother. Bright, cheerful, and creative, she always stood out from others. At 23, Elizabeth was in college dreaming of becoming an artist. Her passion for art sometimes led to conflicts with her parents, especially her father, who believed that art could not provide her with a stable future. However, Elizabeth stubbornly went her own way, not paying attention to criticism. The town of Springfield was full of rumors and gossip, as is often the case in small communities. Local resident Gary, owner of a cafe on the main street, was one of those who always knew all the latest news. He was Richard's friend and often came to his house for a cup of coffee, discussing business and the latest events in the city. It was Gary who first noticed that something had changed in the behavior of James and Elizabeth. He couldn't say exactly what it was, but some subtle tension present between brother and sister made him wary. Detective Andrea Morris, an experienced detective, has long worked in the police department of a neighboring city. Her reputation for solving difficult cases was known far beyond her jurisdiction. Her analytical mind and ability to notice small details that elude others have made her an indispensable specialist in investigating the most complicated crimes. Soon, her skills will prove essential to solving the tragedy that was about to unfold in quiet Springfield. This story begins quietly, like the calm flow of a river, but soon the audience will plunge into the dark depths of forbidden feelings, secrets, and lies. Springfield, which seemed so peaceful and prosperous, will become a place where a real drama will unfold, the outcome of which will be impossible to predict. It all starts with an ordinary day when James and Elizabeth decide to spend time together, but their secret connection, which they so carefully hid, begins to become more and more obvious to others. This will be the beginning of the end, the tragedy of which will soon shake not only their family, but the entire town. Several weeks have passed since Gary, the owner of a local cafe and an old friend of the Hatcher family, first noticed strange behavior in James and Elizabeth. For such a small town as Springfield, any anomaly immediately became the object of attention. But this time, Gary was in no hurry to share his observations with others. He knew that family matters were a delicate matter and did not want to unnecessarily stir up rumors. However, suspicions began to gradually grow, like a snowball. At first, these were minor moments that might seem ordinary at first glance. Gary noticed that James and Elizabeth began to spend much more time together. This was not so unusual for brother and sister who had always been close, but now their meetings took on some kind of secrecy. They often met in secluded places, on the banks of a river, where there were almost no people in the summer months, or in an old abandoned chapel on the outskirts of a city where few people went. One day, late in the evening, when Gary was finishing his workday in a cafe, he saw James and Elizabeth sitting at a table in the corner. Their conversation was quiet, their faces were serious, and their eyes avoided meeting other visitors. Gary couldn't hear their conversation, but the way they leaned towards each other, the way his brother lightly touched his sister's hand, made him wary. There was clearly something more between them than just family affection. As they stood up to leave, Gary noticed how James hugged Elizabeth tightly, and then looking back, they quickly left the cafe as if trying to avoid prying eyes. These little things started to add up to a picture that Gary didn't want to admit. He began to think that some strange connection might have arisen between brother and sister, going beyond ordinary family relationships. But how can you tell Richard, your old friend, about this? How can I explain to him that his children, whom he raised with such love and strict moral principles, could be involved in something forbidden? Gary decided not to jump to conclusions and continued to observe. In the following weeks, he noticed how James and Elizabeth avoided communication with other people, increasingly choosing solitary walks along forest paths that led to an old barn, long abandoned and hidden from prying eyes. This place, which once served as a storage area for tools and agricultural equipment, became their secret hideout. One evening, as dusk began to fall over the city, Gary decided to follow them. He understood that this was not entirely correct, but the feeling of anxiety that settled in his heart did not give him peace. Hidden among the trees, he saw James and Elizabeth enter the barn, after which the door closed behind them. Gary remained waiting, watching the building. His thoughts raced from half-formed guesses to fear of what he might see there. Time passed, but they did not leave. Sometime later, when it was almost dark, the barn door opened again and James and Elizabeth came out. There was a strange mixture of relief and anxiety on their faces, as if they had just gotten rid of a heavy burden, but they understood that the consequences of this were not yet over. Gary remained in his hiding place, not wanting to be seen, but what he saw only strengthened his suspicions. Returning home, Gary could not sleep for a long time. Thoughts about what he saw haunted him. He began to wonder whether he should share his observations with Detective Morris, who was known for her uncompromising approach to uncovering the truth. But to do so would cast a shadow on a family that had always been an example of integrity in Springfield. The next day, Gary tried to talk to Richard, but his friend, as always, was busy with business. They met at a construction site where Richard was supervising a team of workers. Gary tried to hint at what was bothering him, but Richard, engrossed in his work, didn't pay much attention to it. He believed that children were going through normal teenage angst and that it would go away on its own. But Gary felt that the matter was much more serious. He decided that he would continue to observe James and Elizabeth to finally confirm his suspicions. Meanwhile, a feeling of anxiety and a vague premonition of impending trouble flared up in his soul more and more. He knew that if his guesses were confirmed, the consequences would be devastating not only for the Hatcher family, but for the entire city. Meanwhile, James and Elizabeth continued to lead their double lives, trying to hide their secret affair from everyone. But they did not suspect that they were already being watched, and that their every action was becoming part of a large mosaic that would soon form a terrible picture of tragedy. Months had passed since Gary began to notice strange behavior in James and Elizabeth, and his suspicions only grew stronger. Meanwhile, tension was growing in the Hutcher family, which did not go unnoticed by either Richard or Martha. At first, it was small details. James became even more withdrawn and distant than usual, and Elizabeth, usually cheerful, suddenly became nervous and irritable. Their relationship with their parents began to deteriorate, and this led to frequent quarrels. Richard, a man of strict principles, could not understand what was happening to his children. He tried to talk to James, but the conversations ended in nothing. James looked away and went into his room, avoiding revelations. Martha also noticed changes, especially in Elizabeth's behavior. At first, she thought it might be related to her studies or problems with friends, but when she tried to discuss it with her daughter, she was faced with strong resistance and distrust. Elizabeth, always open and trusting with her mother, now closed herself off. She avoided talking about her feelings, and any mention of James caused her obvious anxiety. Martha felt that her daughter was hiding something, but did not know how to reach her. Her heart sank with concern for the children, but she could not understand the reason for these changes. One evening, when the whole family had gathered for dinner, the tension reached its peak. Richard, tired of constant silence and omissions, decided that it was time to dot all the I's. He turned sharply to James, demanding an explanation. "James, what's going on?" he asked, looking at his son across the table. "You've become withdrawn, avoiding work, and your mother is worried. Is something wrong? Maybe you're having problems at work? Or are you quarreling with someone?" James, who until that moment had been intently picking at his plate with his fork, froze. His eyes briefly met those of Elizabeth, who sat opposite him. The look was short, but it conveyed a whole range of emotions: fear, guilt, uncertainty. Elizabeth nervously straightened her hair, avoiding her father's gaze. "It's okay, Dad," James answered quietly, lowering his head again. "It's just a lot of work, that's all." But Richard was not satisfied with this. He was alarmed not only by his son's silence, but also by his daughter's reaction. He noticed how she avoided looking in his direction, how her hands trembled when she reached for the bread. His suspicions that something serious was happening between the children only intensified. "I don't think it's just a job," Richard insisted. "You and your sister have been acting strange lately. If you're having problems, why not share? We are a family, and we must trust each other." These words hung in the air like some kind of accusation. Martha felt the atmosphere in the room becoming increasingly tense. She understood that Richard was trying to understand the situation, but his straightforwardness and rudeness could only make the problem worse. "Maybe we should just talk," she suggested softly, trying to soften the tone of the conversation. "James, Elizabeth, we just want to help you." But there was no reaction. Elizabeth pushed her plate away and stood up from the table. "I'm not hungry," she said over her shoulder and left the room, leaving her parents and brother alone with their worries. After she left, Richard sighed irritably. He was a man of action, accustomed to solving problems quickly and efficiently, but here he was powerless. The son and daughter seemed to have withdrawn into their own world, isolating themselves from him and Martha with a wall of silence. At this time, Gary continued to observe what was happening. He couldn't get the scenes he'd seen in recent weeks out of his head, and his worry for his friends only grew. He realized that he could no longer remain silent. One day, he decided to share his suspicions with Detective Andrea Morris, knowing that she would be able to understand this situation. Detective Morris, known for her sharp mind and professionalism, welcomed Gary into her office at the police department. She listened to him carefully, without interrupting, and as the story progressed, her face became more and more concentrated. "I'm not sure this is something criminal," Gary concluded, rubbing his hands nervously. "But something is clearly wrong. I have known this family for many years, and James and Elizabeth have always been like best friends. And now it's more like something else." Morris nodded thoughtfully, her gaze remaining cold and analytical. "It could just be a family crisis," she noted. "But I agree that there may be something more here, especially if this is due to their secrecy. I'll talk to the family, try to figure out what's going on." Meanwhile, in the Hutcher household, relations continued to deteriorate. The tension between James and Elizabeth became increasingly apparent. They could no longer hide their feelings as they had done before. Every time they were alone, intense, emotional conversations took place between them, which they carefully hid from their parents. However, the secret they kept became increasingly unbearable. Elizabeth increasingly thought that their relationship could not continue. She understood that their relationship would destroy not only their family, but also themselves. Her internal conflict intensified, and she could no longer look at her brother without feelings of guilt and fear. One evening, when her parents were already asleep, Elizabeth approached James in his room. She quietly closed the door behind her, as if afraid that they might be heard. "We can't go on like this, James," she whispered, her voice trembling with tension. "This is wrong, and you know it." James sat on the edge of the bed with his head down. He understood her words perfectly, but could not imagine his life without her. His feelings for his sister outgrew all possible boundaries, and he was ready to do anything to maintain their connection. "I know," he finally answered, looking up at her with eyes full of pain and despair. "But I can't lose you, Elizabeth. We have to come up with something." These words, full of despair and fear, only intensified the internal struggle in Elizabeth's soul. She knew this couldn't go on, that they had to stop before it was too late. But every word, every glance from her brother destroyed her resolve. The next morning, Martha noticed Elizabeth running out of the house without breakfast and heading towards the forest. She knew that her daughter had become more withdrawn lately, but now it seemed especially strange. Martha wanted to follow her, but Richard stopped her, saying that children need space to sort out their problems. But Elizabeth didn't just go for a walk. She headed to the very place where she and James spent a lot of time together, to the old barn. She knew she had to make a decision that would change their lives. A decision that will determine their fate and the fate of the entire family. The transition to a critical point in the lives of James and Elizabeth was inevitable. Their secret romance had reached the stage where they could no longer pretend that everything was under control. The realization that their feelings were forbidden destroyed them from the inside. There was tension in every look, in every word, and this tension slowly but surely pushed them to the edge of the abyss. Elizabeth, feeling that the situation was getting out of control, decided that they had to do something drastic. The meeting in the old barn was to be a turning point in their lives. She thought about leaving with James, starting a new life somewhere far away, where no one would know them or judge them for being together. This idea seemed like salvation to her, but at the same time it was madness. When Elizabeth entered the barn, she saw James sitting on the floor, hunched over and lost in dark thoughts. His face was pale and his eyes were full of melancholy and fear. He raised his head when he heard his sister's steps, and their eyes met. This moment was filled with an emotional storm that played out in their hearts. "We can't do this anymore, James," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling, but there was determination in it. "I thought about it all night. We have to leave. Here we will never be understood, and if someone finds out what is happening between us, it will be the end." James looked at her, trying to process her words. The thought of leaving frightened him, but at the same time, it seemed like the only way out of this nightmare. He couldn't imagine his life without Elizabeth, and the prospect of losing her tore him apart. "Leave?" he repeated, as if he couldn't believe his ears. "Where? How can we start over? We have no money, no plan. This is crazy, Elizabeth." Elizabeth knew he was right, but she had no other choice. She understood that if they stayed, their secret would definitely become apparent. They will not be able to hide their feelings forever, and then the consequences will be catastrophic. "We can start everything from scratch," she persuaded him, sitting down next to him. "I'll sell my jewelry, we can pawn something from the house. The main thing is to get as far away from here as possible. Start a new life where no one will know who we really are." James felt panic wash over him. He understood that the situation was really serious, but the prospect of leaving everything they knew, leaving his parents, his home, his job, seemed too scary to him. However, the fear of losing Elizabeth was stronger. "Are you sure this is the only way out?" he asked, trying to find in her eyes at least some hope for a different path. "Yes," she answered without a shadow of doubt. "Only trouble awaits us here, James. If we stay, sooner or later everything will collapse. We must act now, while there is still time." James sighed heavily, trying to comprehend her words. He understood that she was right, but his heart was breaking at the thought that they would just give up everything and start life from scratch, running from their own past. However, he had no other choice. He knew that he could not live without Elizabeth, and for her sake, he was ready to do anything. "Okay," he finally said, accepting her decision. "We'll leave. But how do we do this? We only have a few days to prepare everything." Elizabeth felt relieved by his words, but also fear. Now they had to act quickly and decisively. She had already outlined a plan: to sell everything that could be sold, collect money, and move as far as possible, to a place where no one would know or look for them. But at that moment, they did not know that fate had already begun to set its traps. While they discussed their plans in the barn, Detective Andrea Morris began her investigation. Gary's suspicions and his conversation with her made her turn her attention to the Hatcher family. Morris, as an experienced detective, began by interviewing neighbors and close family friends, trying to gather information that could shed light on what was happening. She visited Gary's cafe, where he once again told her about everything he had seen and heard over the past months. Morris listened carefully, asking leading questions and taking notes in her notebook. She soon realized that this family was keeping a secret, and that this secret could be much darker than simple family conflicts. Morris decided to talk to James and Elizabeth's parents. She came to their house under the pretext of a routine check, but her purpose was much more serious. Entering the Hatcher house, she immediately felt the tense atmosphere that reigned in the family. Martha, who anxiously met the detective on the threshold, looked tired and nervous, as if something was weighing heavily on her shoulders. "Hello, Mrs. Hatcher," Morris greeted her with a smile. "I'm Detective Morris from the police department. I'm conducting routine surveys among city residents and would like to ask you a few questions. It will only take a few minutes." Martha, a little confused, invited her to come in. She did not know that the reason for the detective's visit was suspicions related to her children. As Morris looked around the house, pretending it was all part of the usual procedure, she noticed the family photographs hanging on the walls. These photographs told about the family's past, but also hid what was now destroying them from the inside. "Mrs. Hatcher, how are your children?" Morris asked, getting to the point. "It seems to me that some changes have taken place in your house recently. Perhaps this is due to problems at work or school." Martha hesitated. Her eyes met the detective's gaze, and at that moment she realized that she suspected something serious. "James and Elizabeth have always been close," Martha answered, trying not to show her emotions. "They had difficulties, like all young people, but nothing to cause concern. They are just a little worried about their affairs. This is fine." But Morris, an experienced detective, noticed Martha nervously fiddling with the hem of her dress. This was a clear sign that the woman was hiding something. "I understand," the detective said calmly, trying not to put pressure on her. "If you have any problems or if you want to talk, I'm always in touch." Morris left her business card, said goodbye and left, leaving Martha alone with her anxious thoughts. After the detective left, Martha felt that something was wrong. She knew that the children were keeping some kind of secret, but until that moment she did not realize how serious this secret could be. Meanwhile, James and Elizabeth were preparing for their escape. They began to secretly pack their things, planning to leave under the cover of darkness, leaving no trace. But every step in this regard was fraught with risk. They did not know that Detective Morris had already begun her investigation, and that their secret was about to be revealed. The escalation of the situation has reached a critical point. James and Elizabeth understood that they had less and less time left, and that every step they took could be the last in their attempt to preserve their love and freedom. But they did not yet realize that this path was leading them to an inevitable disaster. The night came that was to become decisive in the lives of James and Elizabeth. The silence that reigned in the Hatcher house seemed deceptive. Inside this cozy family nest was a storm of emotions and fears, ready to burst out. James and Elizabeth spent the entire day in intense preparation, trying not to give away their plan. They knew that time was short, and if they did not leave now, their secret would be revealed, and the consequences could be disastrous. Elizabeth quietly packed a few essentials into a small suitcase, trying not to make a sound. Thoughts of a future full of uncertainty flashed through her head. She understood that their decision to leave was an act of desperation, but at the same time it was their only chance for salvation. Her heart sank with fear and anxiety, but she forced herself to move on. James was in his room when there was a soft knock on the door. It was Elizabeth. She entered, silently closing the door behind her, and their eyes met. At this moment, they didn't need words to understand each other. Their looks said more than words could. They knew that ahead was a road into the unknown, but it was their choice, and they were ready for any consequences. "We have to go," Elizabeth said quietly, not hiding the trembling in her voice. "Now or never." James nodded and they went downstairs together, trying not to wake their parents. The house in which they grew up now seemed to them a strange and dangerous place from which they had to escape in order to keep their secret. They moved silently, like shadows, but their hearts beat like drums, foreshadowing the coming disaster. They were about to leave through the back door when they heard footsteps on the stairs. It was Richard, their father. He stood in the way, his face expressing a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Where are you going?" he asked, looking at their suitcases. At this moment, the tension that had been building for many months reached its climax. Elizabeth froze, not knowing what to answer, but James, realizing the seriousness of the situation, took a step forward. "Father, we're leaving," he said firmly, trying not to show his excitement. "We can't stay here any longer." Richard frowned, his gaze becoming stern and cold. He felt that his children were hiding something, and it was something serious. But he couldn't let them just leave without explaining themselves. "You can't just up and leave," he said, his voice full of determination. "What's going on here? What are you hiding?" These words, full of suspicion and reproach, caused a wave of indignation in James's soul. He felt fear give way to anger. The father didn't understand what they had been through, and his attempt to stop them only made him want to run more. "We're not children anymore," James snapped, taking another step forward. "We will decide for ourselves what is best for us." But Richard was not going to back down. His children, whom he had raised with such love and severity, now stood before him as strangers, ready to reject everything he taught them. He felt that he was losing control of the situation, and this caused him fear and anger. "I won't let you leave until you explain what's going on," he said firmly, feeling the tension between them growing. Elizabeth, standing behind, realized that the situation was getting out of control. She knew that if they didn't leave now, they would never be able to do so. Terrible thoughts flashed through her head, and at that moment she realized that she was ready to do anything to keep their secret. She took a step forward, placing a hand on her brother's shoulder to stop him, but her gesture was perceived as a signal to action. James, feeling his sister's support, jumped up and, driven by despair, pushed his father. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. Richard lost his balance and, before he could grab the railing, fell to the floor, hitting his head on the edge of the wooden step. The sound was dull and eerie, like thunder in the middle of silence. Elizabeth screamed, rushing to her father, but it was too late. Blood began to ooze from the back of his head, leaving a dark stain on the floor. Richard didn't move anymore. His eyes glazed over and the life slowly drained from his body. At that moment, their world completely collapsed. James, realizing what he had done, froze in place, unable to believe what had happened. His mind refused to accept reality, but the blood on his hands and his father's lifeless body said that turning back was no longer possible. Elizabeth, gripped by horror, tried to shake her father, hoping that he would wake up, that this was just a nightmare. But it was all in vain. Richard was dead, and it was their fault. The silence that reigned in the house now seemed deafening. They understood that their lives ended the moment James pushed his father. Everything they tried to save was destroyed in an instant. The secret they kept now took on a new, even more terrible meaning. "We have to leave," Elizabeth whispered, her voice shaking with panic. "Now!" James couldn't move. He felt his legs become weak, and his heart sank with horror and remorse. But Elizabeth, realizing that every moment of delay only worsened their situation, grabbed his hand and dragged him to the exit. They ran out of the house, leaving only chaos and death in their wake. Their plan to escape into the unknown has now turned into a flight from justice. They did not know what awaited them ahead, but they realized that the way back was cut off forever. Meanwhile, Detective Morris, who was at the police department, received an urgent call. She was informed of a suspicious incident at the Hatcher home. She immediately realized that this could be related to her investigation, and without wasting a minute, she went to the place. When Morris arrived on scene, she saw that the doors to the Hatcher home were open. There was a strange silence inside, broken only by the quiet creaking of the floor under her feet. The detective stepped inside and immediately felt something was wrong. The smell of blood and mortal danger hung in the air. Morris quickly scanned the rooms until she came across Richard's lifeless body lying at the foot of the stairs. The last emotion frozen on his face was a mixture of surprise and fear. This sight, despite her years of experience, made her heart stop for a moment. She understood that something terrible had happened here, and she also understood that the culprits had already fled. But now she had a task. to find them and find out the whole truth. The investigation, which began as a routine investigation, has now turned into a murder case. Morris was determined to solve the case, but she knew the truth wouldn't be easy to find, especially given all the confusion that surrounded the family. James and Elizabeth, meanwhile, were running away from home, away from the past, away from what they had done. Their hearts were beating stronger than ever, and only one question was running through their heads. What now? What's next? They didn't know that their future now depended not only on their own decisions, but also on how far they could escape justice. The arrest of James and Elizabeth ended their flight, but it was only the beginning of a long and painful process that would have to go through for everyone involved in this tragic story. After they were taken to the police station, Detective Andrea Morris began further investigation to collect all the necessary evidence and bring the case to trial. Her task now was not only to confirm the guilt of these two, but also to understand what exactly led them to this terrible ending. James and Elizabeth were placed in separate cells to avoid any contact between them. Morris understood that their connections could cause new problems and sought to prevent any possibility of collusion. Even though they were no longer resisting, their emotional state was extremely unstable. Elizabeth cried almost non-stop, her face distorted with pain and fear. James, on the other hand, was deeply depressed and showed no emotion. He seemed broken and detached from the reality around him. Meanwhile, the investigation team continued its work. Evidence collected at the crime scene confirmed Detective Morris's initial suspicions. Richard Hatcher had been killed in a deliberate push. The blood found at the crime scene belonged to James, indicating his direct participation in the tragedy. This evidence became key in building the prosecution. Morris also began studying the financial activities of James and Elizabeth. It was discovered that they had withdrawn large sums of money from their accounts several days before the murder. These actions confirmed the assumption that their escape was pre-planned. All these facts added up to a single picture, which suggested that Richard's murder was not an accident, but was the result of a long and painful process that led to a tragic end. Morris interviewed other family members, including Martha Hatcher, who was completely devastated by the incident. The loss of her husband and the arrest of her children became an unbearable blow for her. She remembered moments when she noticed changes in the behavior of James and Elizabeth, but she could never imagine that it would end this way. Her words and memories only strengthened the detective's suspicions that the relationship between brother and sister was far from ordinary. The investigation moved quickly, and the case was soon brought to court. Morris prepared all the necessary evidence to make the case as strong as possible. The trial attracted national attention. People discussed this case, trying to understand what could have pushed two young people to commit such a terrible crime. The story, which began as an ordinary family conflict, turned into a nightmare that affected not only the participants themselves, but also the entire small town in which they lived. During the trial, all the evidence was presented: fingerprints, financial transactions, eyewitness accounts, and of course, examination results. All this proved the guilt of James and Elizabeth. The judge hearing the case was adamant. He understood that before him stood people whose lives had been destroyed not only by murder, but also by the secret they were trying to hide. The verdict was passed quickly. James and Elizabeth were found guilty of murdering their father. The judge sentenced them to long prison terms without the possibility of parole. This decision was made taking into account all the circumstances of the case, but it left an indelible mark on the hearts of those who were close to this family. For Martha Hatcher, it was the end of her world. Having lost her husband and children, she was left alone in a house that now seemed empty and cold to her. Memories of happy days when her family was together haunted her, reminding her that things could have been different. She could not find consolation and continued to live with a feeling of guilt that she could not see and prevent this tragedy. James and Elizabeth were sent to separate prisons to avoid any contact between them. They spent the rest of their days in isolation, wondering what had brought them to this point. Their secret love, which once seemed like the whole world to them, has now turned into a prison from which there was no way out. Every day spent behind bars was a reminder of the mistake that ruined their lives. The story of this family became a warning to everyone who heard about it. She showed that some secrets are too hard to hide, and that trying to run away from the truth can lead to even greater tragedies. The people of Springfield will never forget what happened at the Hatcher house, and this case will forever remain in the memory of the city as one of the most terrible crimes. After the arrest of James and Elizabeth, their lives turned into a series of interrogations, court hearings, and anticipation of the inevitable verdict. For Detective Andrea Morris, this case was not only a professional challenge, but also a personal one. She knew the investigation was over, but the question remained. How could it have gotten this far? What could have pushed the brother and sister onto such a fatal path? After their arrest, they were immediately separated and placed in different prisons. This decision was dictated by the fear that their presence together could lead to collusion or attempts at manipulation. Inside the prison walls, James and Elizabeth found themselves completely isolated, both physically and emotionally. They could no longer support each other, and this only increased their despair. For James, life behind bars was an unbearable ordeal. He, accustomed to solitude but never experiencing true isolation, found himself face to face with his fears and regrets. Every day reminded him of what had happened, and these memories became real torture for him. The moment he pushed his father kept flashing back and forth in his mind, and he realized that his actions had destroyed not only his own life, but the lives of everyone he loved. Elizabeth, despite her young age and external fragility, tried to cope with what was happening. She knew that she would never see James again, and this realization was the hardest for her. Her days in prison were filled with thoughts of how things could have been different if she had stopped them in time, if she had not given vent to the feelings that became fatal for them. She remembered their plans to escape, to start a new life, but now she realized that these dreams were doomed from the very beginning. The trial attracted national attention. People discussed this case, trying to understand how family affection could turn into something so destructive. During the trial, all the evidence was presented: fingerprints, financial transactions, examination results, and witness statements. All this added up to a convincing picture of James and Elizabeth's guilt. The verdict was pronounced with cold inevitability. James and Elizabeth were convicted of the murder of Richard Hatcher and sentenced to long prison terms without parole. The judge took into account all the circumstances of the case, but the severity of the sentence reflected the gravity of their crime. For Martha Hatcher, this verdict was the final blow. Having lost her husband and children, she was left alone in a house that was once filled with love and happiness. Now this house has become for her only a reminder of what she lost. She continued to live with guilt and constant memories of what she could have done to prevent this tragedy. But the past could not be returned, and she was forced to come to terms with the fact that her life had changed forever. The story of James and Elizabeth, which began as an innocent affair, turned into a tragedy that destroyed not only their lives, but also the lives of their family. Their fate became a warning to all who heard about them. The people of Springfield will never forget what happened at the Hatcher house, and it will be remembered as one of the worst crimes in the history of their city. For Detective Andrea Morris, completing this case was not only a professional achievement, but also a source of deep reflection. She knew that she had done everything possible to ensure that justice would prevail, but in her soul there remained a feeling of sadness for those whose lives were destroyed. She understood that some secrets were too dangerous to keep, and that trying to escape the truth could lead to even greater tragedies. The story of this family became a reminder for her of the fragility of human life and how important it is to notice signals in time that can prevent trouble. As the trial ended and the final pages of the case were closed, life in Springfield slowly began to return to normal. But the residents of this small town knew that this story would forever remain part of their past, part of that dark side that they could not forget. The Hatcher house, now empty and abandoned, has become a symbol of a broken family and a reminder that even the quietest places can hide the darkest secrets.